Hello, there we are again. I just wanted to inform you that I do not change shirts every hour, but these lectures were recorded on different days. This is now, my place is now Friday. Um, I think this is, as far as I'm concerned, this is the most creative and probably the most interesting part of modeling of systems, of biological systems that we're going to talk about, and see how we tackle conceptual modeling, and we're going to limit ourselves to the cardiorespiratory system. I find it harder to do than the mathematical modeling, which once you have a diagram is more of a cookbook approach. And what I'll do is we'll look at the human patient simulator, but we're going to open the hood a little bit, and I'll take you for a look inside. Not so much the hardware, which is quite impressive, but we'll look at the models and the software. Now, when we sat around a table at the University of Florida about almost 30 years ago, we set model requirements, and we thought I helped my colleagues think in terms of independent and dependent variables. And in clinical terms, they're called therapeutic interventions and monitored signals. And we came up with a single overall block diagram for the patient with lots of dependent variables or monitored signals. And this is not an exhaustive list, but we had, for example, gas flow in and out of the mouth, chest movement, gas composition, especially oxygen and CO2 of the exhaled gases, some other respiratory parameters, respiratory rate, tidal volume, heart rate, which you can measure at a number of places. The ECG is really a multi-variable signal, 3, 5, 12 leads ECG, depending on what kind of a patient and intervention. Again, blood pressures can be as many as 5 different blood pressures when you use a Swan-Ganz catheter. Cardiac output, which was at the time measured with thermodilution and oxygen saturation. And there's more. This, as I said, not in the skin color, for example, is not in this list, but changes of skin color when oxygen goes low, for example, could be in this list as well. There's a lot of things anesthesiologists in this case, but in acute care physicians in general can do. They can adapt the pressures on the ventilator, they can give more or less oxygen, they can give intravenous medication. And at the time I got a list of 55 different drugs that fluid therapies, whole blood, ringer lactate, other types of fluids. In case of cardiac arrest, you can do chest compression and defibrillation. So again, a whole list of requirements. On top of that, my colleagues wanted to be able to simulate different physiological states like hypovolemia or hypercarbia, had too much CO2, those kinds of states, and they wanted to be able to simulate different patient characteristics. We had in mind, let's say, an average normal patient, but also a geriatric patient, a pregnant female patient. So all of these patients needed to be characterized. So those were quite some model requirements, and I was used as an electrical engineer at looking at these kinds of block diagrams, one independent variable, one dependent variable, and then I got this. So at the time I still had hair, and I lost a few over that. But we tackled the problem anyhow, and started thinking about a conceptual model to fill this box. A conceptual model of mostly the cardiorespiratory system, and then the drug effects on the system. And our main challenge was to get to subsystems. Because once you have subsystems, you can work on one simpler system at a time, or on some systems we knew that there were several models out there, so some subsystems had models, and we didn't have to design those again. And together with my mentor from Eindhoven, Jan Benneken, we came up with the following diagram. We knew that there was a kind of a pyramid of connected processes concerning ventilation and circulation. There's the two, and make the distinction between ventilation and respiration. We'll get to that in a second. But the two basic phenomena without which almost everything stops are gas getting in and out of the lungs and circulation, blood circulating. Now, these two processes carry all kinds of substances, oxygen, CO2, anesthetic gases. They can carry heat and hormones. So transport and transformation was the second layer, depending on ventilation and circulation. And then on top of these layers, there's a number of control systems. For example, when our CO2 is high, we start to hyperventilate to get rid of it, or when our blood pressure is low, our heart rate goes up, and then we adjust, try to get that pressure back to normal values. Also, as part of control, we have external control systems, mostly using drugs. So much later on, I realized that the types of variables in these different layers were different. So at the bottom, we're mostly looking at flow rates and related pressure, volumes and pressures. At the next layer, we're looking at concentrations of hormones, drugs, etc. And at the higher layer, we're mostly looking at nerve potentials. And much even later, I realized that this is kind of a nice division of the engineering disciplines as well. There's the mechanical engineers look at flow rates and fluid dynamics. The chemical engineers look at concentrations and metabolism transformation. And the electrical engineers look at potentials. And of course, being an electrical engineer, I didn't mind being on top of the pyramid. But we're still not at subsystems. And that actually turned out to be easier than we thought, because we simply split this pyramid and say, well, and then start looking at what are the variables in between these connected processes. And I won't go into all of them, but for example, ventilation and circulation drive gas exchange in the lungs, oxygen uptake, CO2 delivery. And for that, you need minute ventilation, going from ventilation to transport and transformation, and you need perfusion. So ventilation, perfusion, you may have heard that in your physiology classes a long time ago. So these are clearly often measurable variables that go in between. And I think I mentioned high CO2 is something that comes from the transport and transformation system and then goes back to ventilation and stimulates ventilation. Now, this is not a tradition. So we have subsystems, but this is not a traditional block diagram. But we did make a more traditional block diagram. And this is one of the figures of my book. And there's really only there's a minor change here. I separated the control of breathing and the control of circulation, but all the other systems and the variables that link them are there. For example, I mentioned circulation has an output variable, blood flow rates and volumes, which go into transport and transformation, and ventilation has as an output gas flow rates and volumes, which also go into especially the pulmonary gas exchange, which is part of transport and transformation. And then we have the two main control loops as far as the cardiorespiratory system is concerned. Control of breathing, which mainly controls depth and frequency of breathing, and control of circulation, which actually controls a lot of different variables. So the controlled variable itself is blood pressures, mainly systemic blood pressure, but it does so through what I termed cardiovascular control effectors. The word is just behind my image, which include heart rate and contractility and two types of vascular resistance. So we now have a number of subsystems and their causal connections. And for the actual simulator, the diagram is a bit more complex, also because it involves drugs and it involves the electrocardiogram, etc. But for our purposes, this is a reasonable simplification. We make choices. The word simplification means choices, and this is a diagram that Hans Swart and I came up with, and I'll show it a number of times. We often make in modeling very important choices, and we can go, for example, I could have presented the 13 or 14 compartment diagram or this 5 compartment diagram. So that's a choice that we build into our conceptual model, and which will have an influence on the model downstream. What I'll do is there's a second type of diagram that we use as a conceptual model. There may be even more, but I mainly use 2, and they're closely related to circuit diagrams. But I don't like using electrical circuit diagrams. For me, they're fine, and as an electrical engineer, but for a physiologist, for a clinician, they're not so fine, and even a mechanical engineer prefers mechanical diagrams. So I use what I call direct representation. So if it's a hydraulic system, I use a hydraulic diagram, and if it's a gas exchange system, I'll use other symbols. So what I did here on this slide is for each and every block, well, for 2 of the blocks of the previous diagram, we came up with conceptual models, one of the circulation and one of the respiratory gas transport and transformation. And they're both also, you can find both of these diagrams in my book, and the one on the left is a little bit simplified, made it a bit more symmetrical. And it starts, for example, with the left ventricle, with a valve after it, aortic valve, and a mitral valve before it, the systemic arteries, the systemic vascular resistance, the systemic veins, and back to the right heart with its 2 valves, and then into the pulmonary circulation with the arterial side and the venous side, and the pulmonary vascular resistance. And for example, one simplification I made also with respect to this figure 8.3 is that I took the atria out. And you can do that if you have good reasons to say, well, for my purposes, the contribution of the atria to the overall blood flow and blood pressure is not that significant. So for whatever purpose you have, if I'm looking, for example, only at respiratory gas transport, that may be a valid simplification. Now, then, one of the other blocks in the overall block diagram is respiratory gas transport. And you can see there's a resemblance there between the diagrams on the left and the right. The ventilation here is not included, but the circulation is. So the circles in both diagrams represent a link between the circulation and respiratory gas transport. And if I take, for example, oxygen, and I'll start in the lungs, in the alveolar space. Oxygen then flows into, carried by the bloodstream, into the arterial pool, and we call that the arterial pool because it lumps a number of cardiovascular compartments. It makes the respiratory gas transport model, a bit simpler, more efficient, and we didn't need these extra compartments anyhow. And then from the arterial blood, oxygen flows to different systemic tissues, and we actually do have a number of parallel compartments here, but the tissues have not only blood, they also have tissue, and within the tissue consumption takes place. So that's the purpose of the little arrow at the bottom, where oxygen is consumed and then metabolized into CO2, and then whatever amount of oxygen is left in the venous blood, it's actually quite a bit, goes back to the venous pool, again a regrouping of cardiovascular compartments, and flows back to the alveolar space. There's a bit of blood, usually only a bit of blood, 2%, that bypasses the alveolar space and doesn't get in touch with oxygen in the alveolar gas. So, and for example, for smokers, that shunt is instead of 2% is 5%, or somebody who has a collapsed lung has a 50% shunt. So it's a very important respiratory parameter. And then at the top of this diagram, we have the ventilation. That's another underlying model, which is one of the blocks in the previous diagram. But there we really only look at dead space, the part where there's no exchange with blood, and then the alveolar space. And again, there's an important choice here. At least in this model, there's only a single alveolar space, which is justified if we look at two lungs that are ventilated in parallel. But of course, it's not justified if we want to be able to simulate a collapsed lung, as I mentioned before. Then we really need two alveolar spaces, but still a single dead space. So again, you've heard me make a number of simplifications and assumptions here. So be aware of that, in this very creative phase, you do make assumptions that may have far-going consequences downstream. To establish these models, conceptual models, I looked for standard symbols, and I can find them here and there. But each and every engineering discipline has their own set of standard symbols. So I tried to stay close to those, but I had to make some modifications and in a way proposed my own visual language to model these systems. So for ventilation and circulation, I use hydraulic, relatively standard hydraulic symbols. For transport and transformation, I came up with these symbols and tried to make them different enough from the bottom ones so that you know what you're modeling. And then for the control part, I was able to use fairly standard transfer functions. And then sometimes I write an equation in them for a time constant, for example, or a characteristic in the form of a graph. So these are the symbols I introduce also in my book, and that allow us to make these conceptual models. And we talked through two examples of the bottom part already. So with that, you now have a set of tools to design conceptual models of the cardiorespiratory system, and you can actually use them for quite a few others. There's other tools, but these tools have helped me work on cardiorespiratory systems over the last 30 years. And then the final step in the modeling process is to derive, not in the modeling and simulation process, but in the modeling process, is to derive a mathematical model, which we will do in our next lecture. Talk to you in a bit.